Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side, part of It Matters Radio. And today I have with me a new friend. Her name is Adena Bank Lees, and she is a social worker who has written, I think, a very interesting and important book on a topic that most people never even think about. It's called, Covert Emotional Incest. The Hidden Sexual Abuse, a story of hope and healing. So let's start, Adena, by welcoming you to Walking on the Weene Side and very quickly asking you a simple question. What is covert emotional incest? Easy.
Great question, Ken. Great question. Well, covert emotional incest, it's an elusive form of emotional sexual abuse, where there does not have to be direct genital contact. And it's characterized by 3 or 4 things. One is that the child is used and put in the substitute or surrogate spouse role to one or both of the parents. And by that means that there has been a breach of what we call the intergenerational boundary. And we can talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
Another piece is, again, if a child is made a surrogate spouse, there's something called triangulation that's happening in the family system. And we can talk about that too. What does that mean? And another piece is, and this is what I've added from Dr. Ken Adams and Dr. Pat Love, who have written about what they call covert incest or emotional incest. I've added this piece of objectification, which is the child is used as an object, not seen as a human being, and sexual objectification is part of that as well. So that's what covert emotional incest is.
Now, having grown up in an Ashkenazi Jewish family, and knowing how crazy my mother was and how she used me, okay, are we going to say that, like, that kind of cultural stuff? And I think a lot of cultures are like that. But for me, of course, clearly, it's this particular brand of Jewish culture. Are we saying, in effect, that that's pathology, or how do we draw that line? Where are we going to draw that line?
Well, I love that you brought that up because I grew up in an Ashkenazic Jewish home too. And so in the book, I say something like, we just say that's a Jewish mother, right, who's so overly involved and can really use her child to get her emotional needs met. So, are we pathologizing every culture? No. What are we doing? We're looking at the impact on the child and the kind of behaviors and symptoms and consequences that the child experiences to see if that has negatively impacted that child. And that's how I would diagnose or assess, I don't like to diagnose, but assess whether this dynamic has happened or not. And they also talk about, in family systems therapy, they talk about something called enmeshment, which is that the child or the person doesn't have enough room to be who they are.
Well, they're too busy being used as a tool.
Yes. Yes. And so sometimes I've gotten asked, so what's the difference between emotional incest, covert emotional incest, and enmeshment? And I would say that the line about the sexual energy that is inherent in that surrogate spouse role that gets dictated and transferred and transmitted to that child and really messes with their sexual identity, ability to have intimate relationships. These are some of the kinds of things we see as the kid grows up.
Yeah, and on the plus side, as we're making an assessment, of course, it tends to produce lots of therapists. Raise your hand if you're one.
That's why we saved for my son's therapy fund instead of college fund. Right?
Now, the other thing is, of course, again, I'm saying we have to be sure that we're aware that we're talking about a range rather than a specific, oh, it's this or that. We get into the whole overt, the physical part of it, and often the covert has a physical component. The fact that it hasn't reached, say, to genital contact, or that the genital contact is somehow rationalized. I remember one family I saw years ago where the youngster, the older boy, was beginning to have issues, which is, brought them into therapy. And the mother was still giving him baths in which she was washing his genitals.
Yes.
And she really did not see that might be part of the issue. He, by the way, was 11 and fast approaching puberty.
Right, and she didn't see that there was a difficulty with that, or that there was a boundary that needed to be in place, right?
Right, yeah.
And that's a part of, absolutely, that is a part of what we would call the covert emotional incest. Mm. And the intense sexual or overly sexualized experience material. We can also talk about kids who are watching pornography with their parents. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've worked with people and men in particular, which I think is interesting, men whose mothers were giving them enemas up until a later age, almost through puberty, very obsessed.
Well, my mother was totally obsessed with my anus.
And it's not, they never saw it as sexual. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They never saw it as sexual, but very much did that impact the child's sexual development, no question, right?
Oh, yeah.
But that's why we're talking about this, Ken. That's why I'm so passionate about this, because it's there, but we don't see it for what it is. Mm. And we don't acknowledge it, and people don't have a context for it or a name for it. And so it just kind of goes by the wayside. Mm. So I really want people to have some names for it. And as you were saying, on a continuum, not to pathologize everything, but to give them a context so that you can see what fits. Your audience can see what fits for them and doesn't fit for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that goes through my mind a lot about it is very often when you're doing group kind of dynamic experiences with people, you have people kind of approach one another until one of them is physically uncomfortable and they don't want to get any closer. And you talk about space, and then you can talk about boundaries.
Yes.
And one of the problems for kids who grow up in that kind of environment is their own conflict about their boundaries. So on the one hand, they feel they have no boundaries, that they have no integrity as a physical being, because it can be so easily violated. And on the other hand, they have this rage that makes them want to keep people apart and keep people away. And so you see this kind of, can I get close, not get close? And often I have seen that when people come for couples counseling or premarital counseling, and you see one or both people having this tremendous, can I trust, can I not trust, can I allow closeness, can I not allow closeness? And it they become like electrons, the outer rim of a atom going back and forth.
Yes, absolutely. And the conflict inside is really intense. There's a lot of rage. There's a lot of terror. It's, am I going to be engulfed, right? Am I going to be just taken over because that's what my experience was and I felt trapped and all that? Or, am I going to be so alone and abandoned? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that conflict, that's real. And that's very, very painful. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So you're making a really good point.
Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things that makes this much harder for us now, and why it is becoming more an issue in modern American society, is that unlike, for example, when people were living back in those little towns in the Russian Pale or someplace like that, to stay with the Ashkenazi Jewish experience. They're now living in these complex worlds where the people are neo-local. We don't live in the same town that we grew up in. In fact, most of us have moved many times. We don't live with those same people, and everything's not so. What could work in a little town, because everybody kind of fit together in this strange pattern, except for those where it went too far, and we'll get to them in a sec, I guess. But for the most part, everybody could kind of function because the roles were all nicely set. But now we're living in a more complex world. And that kind of emotional incest, it becomes harder to work with.
Well, possibly. I think also what we're seeing is that nuclear families are more isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say, a single parent family, high risk for this dynamic. Addicted family, high risk for this dynamic. Chronic mental illness, high risk for this dynamic. Why? Because if a caregiver, adult caregiver, does not have the support of their peer, if let's say a traditional family, there's two caregivers with the children, right? Mm-hmm. If there's not the support in that, what I call in unified executive committee of the adults, and one of them, they don't have the skills, this is the triangulation, so they use one or more of their kids to get their individual needs met or their emotional needs met. Mm-hmm. And so that's how they get support, and they don't go to peers or professionals. There's not that support in the marital relationship, or if it's not marital, whatever. And if it's a single parent family, wow, what the pressure on that single parent, whether it be a male or female, doesn't matter. And so what I teach is get support, ask for professional help, go to your adults so that you don't use your children, because that, for me, that's the main definition of child abuse. If you want to really broaden it, mm-hmm. is when children are used to meet the emotional or physical sexual needs of their adult caregivers.
That is a very powerful thought for us to take a little break on.
Okay.
I'm often asked, how exactly does someone who has been the subject of emotional incest present as an adult in a romantic relationship? And if you think that the child, let's say there was a young girl who became the confidant, the emotional support for her father, if you think that she played a very special role in his life, and for her, she herself felt very special, maybe privileged beyond what the other siblings may have had as a place in the family. When she grows up to be an adult, her relationships are compromised simply because by the time she becomes that romantic partner, she has already been the support. In an adult relationship, that same young girl who is now an adult woman will be avoidant of love, will be avoidant toward her partner, because love looks like and has been experienced as smothering. It has been an obligation, it has been smothering, and it has been more about serving the needs of others. If she's been doing that most of her life for her parent, for her father, then she's not likely to want to do this in a romantic relationship. And hence, she will be avoidant and running from intimacy versus running towards.
Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. My guest today is Adena Bank Lees, author of Covert Emotional Incest, The Hidden Sexual Abuse, A Story of Hope and Healing, which, by the way, folks, you can buy in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. And I do urge you to go and get yourself a copy because it's a real worthwhile read. Now, Adena, we were talking about triangulation, and I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to spell out that, define that for the audience.
Thank you so much, Ken. So triangulation is a dynamic that happens in a family when the parents or caregivers don't have the skills to deal directly with each other. So they use one or more of their kids to get their emotional, physical needs met. So basically, most people are trying to do the best they can to be the best parents they can. So when I talk about this dynamic, this is not about blaming anybody. Okay, this is about understanding what the heck is going on in a family system and to see how we can change it up so that it's healthy for everybody. So along with triangulation, what happens is there's this thing called the intergenerational boundary, which we mentioned earlier. And the intergenerational boundary is an invisible structure or energy that's supposed to be in place between the executive committee of the parents or caregivers, adults, and the children. It defines the power differential. So it says, okay, kids have a say in the family, but they don't get a vote necessarily on big things. Like, are we going to be moving from New York City to Los Angeles? Kids could say, I don't want to move. But the adults have the power that, you know what, we need to move. And we hear what you're saying, and we'll listen to your feelings, but we're going to be making those decisions. When the intergenerational boundary is breached, the child jumps up into the same power structure as the adults and is a peer or in that spousal role to one or both of their parents, and then starts making adult decisions and possibly can start kind of hijacking the household and making those. Parentified child is in family therapy, right? But this is more than just being parentified. This is being in that spousal role, which is a sexual role, whether there's physical sex happening or not. And that sexual energy gets transmitted to that child unconsciously, not words, a lot of times, sometimes yes. And that impacts their sexual development. It sexualizes them. And I don't want to go on too long because we wanted to define triangulation and intergenerational boundary. There's so much that happens based on when the parents are not able to deal with each other directly, which is why couples therapy is so important. And that then that intergenerational boundary is breached and the kids no longer get to be the kids. Now they're in that adult or spousal role, which is too much for them. It's overwhelming, but they feel special.
Of course, it can go the other way too. Where the boundary that is being broken is that the parent gives up the adult role and becomes the child role and looks to be in a childlike relationship, in which case, unless there's some outside force, things go totally awry, of course.
Exactly, and I see that a lot because I work a lot with addiction and addictive family systems, and I see that so much in that system that the addict becomes the child. And, I have kids going to go get their mom or dad from the bar.
Oh, yeah. Lots of kids in this have grown up going to get dad from the bar. And again, within certain cultures, it's almost acceptable as long as the whole social system is working.
And I think it's important to say, too, that, the system works. It's there to get to develop homeostasis, right? That's what systems do to have some sort. So the family system where covert emotional incest is happening, it functions.
As long as, yes, it functions until it doesn't, because it can also not function.
Right.
But one of the things you were talking about was triangulation, and of course, the implication of triangulation as a concept is that it takes three to tango. Three or more to tango.
Three or more, exactly.
Right?
3 or more.
As opposed to two. And so you have often, for example, the mother, well, in my case, it was the mother who was involved in the emotional incestuous kind of stuff with me. And then you have the father, and what is he getting out of it? And he might be getting out of it the ability to distance himself. Or he may be getting out of it the hiding of his pathology.
Correct.
Or something like that. So when you see this going on, one of the things as a therapist that I always know is, hey, I got to be aware that there is a system. It's a whole family. It's not just this one person. which brings up one of my problems with the whole mental health model we use in this country, which is the emphasis on having a patient of record.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Absolutely. The identified patient, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really the system. It's the system. And Ken, if we even want to, broaden that just from, let's say, a nuclear family or even more of an extended family, let's look at our society right now. And you mentioned something about that in terms of the complication that happens now. And we are an over-sexualized society, yet sex is still dirty and a secret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a very strange, I think very close to covert emotional incest in a family is how we deal with sex in a society. And, so I think one of the questions people might have in their mind at this point is, well, gee, I don't want to do this to my kid. I want my kid to grow up normal and healthy. I don't want to, break these generational borders and things. But how do I give my kid then an appropriate sexual education? How do because they have to learn somewhere. How do I do it?
Absolutely. I mean, if I don't teach my kid about healthy sexuality, then they're not going to have the tools or the skills, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to educate yourself about child development and to talk with professionals. So, for example, when my son was growing up, I went to a child specialist. As much of a therapist as I am, and I've studied all that, I was still the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I needed outside information to help me be the best mother I could be. And so we did a lot of that kind of discussion. And when Ian would ask questions, I would give him age-appropriate answers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all he needed. He didn't need a long explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we also modeled in our home, we modeled that affection was okay. I wanted him to see that. I wanted him to see a loving relationship. I wanted him to know that he couldn't get in between his mother and his father, his mother and his stepmother, that we were that unified executive committee.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have overly sexualized material. We didn't talk about overly sexualized things in front of him, etc. And I'll just give you another example is that, so in my family, one of the things my dad did that I confronted him on was he was very free. And so he walked around in his underwear. And when I was little, never thought about it. As I became an adolescent, it was really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he would do that. My friends were over and he'd walk through the living room into the kitchen like that. Mm-hmm. And I confronted him and said, Dad, I'm really uncomfortable with this. I don't want you to do this. And he said, that's your effing problem. It's my house. I'll do what I want.
And I think the fact that he used effing in there is exactly part of what the message is. This is about my sexuality. My daddy, big gorilla sexuality.
And so, yeah, and as much as my dad loved me and listened to a lot of things when I would share my feelings, this was one of the places where I wasn't getting heard, Mm-hmm. And so that was really embarrassing. There was shame that I was experiencing. And then the piece of my reality around this stuff didn't matter. And so I felt even more crazy. And that's what a lot of people feel is, they feel crazy. Mm-hmm. The last piece I'll give you is my dad and I were out when I was 18, 19, and people would come up to us. We'd be, eating dinner out or having a coffee together or something like that. People would say, "Oh, is this your wife?" And we would laugh. We thought that was cute and funny at that point, right?
The nonverbal communication that went on
That's right.
was so sexualized that other people were reacting to it.
They were picking up on it, right? And we were interacting more like lovers than like father and daughter, even though there was no physical contact, but people were picking up on it. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you one last piece. I'm a Bill Maher fan, okay? And so I watch him, and one of the jokes that he makes, and he calls Ivanka Trump's daughter wife.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's, and I can't diagnose anybody, right? Because I don't have them in my office. But what I'm saying is that is a classic piece of what we're talking about here.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And we see a lot more of it than we realize. And I think I want to go back to one thing you said, because it really is so basic to what I believe, that if you want to teach your children sexuality, the place you start is in your own life as an adult. If you as an adult are living in a good sexual, emotional, self-fulfilling, authentic way, then your children are going to learn from that, emulate it, and listen to you too. If you are not accomplishing that for yourself, then in point of fact, why should your kid listen to you?
Well, I so appreciate you being so clear on that, because it really comes back to, and I talk about this in the book, and Dan Siegel has done research on this and writes about this in his books on parenting, is that whatever traumatic material we have, whatever places that we haven't worked through and are not living in that authentic, healthy way, we're not going to be able to parent in a healthy way. And it's going to impact the bond that we have with our kids and how they live in their own skin. So right on, it begins with me. And how am I modeling? Because we know modeling, right? Most important, powerful form of learning.
Absolutely. So folks, I've been talking with Adena Bank Lees, the author of Covert Emotional Incest. Now, I read your book online, and before we take the next break, I was wondering, do you have a copy of the print so that people can see what the cover looks like? So when they go to Amazon to get a copy, they can say, oh yeah, hey, it looks like that.
So this is, let's put it up the right way, right?
Yeah, okay.
So there's the cover of the book.
Uh-huh.
And you can see the little girl in between her parents, right?
We pulled them out.
Right. Which way do I go? Which way do I go? And this really, that photo captured it for me from my own experience about how I felt and about a lot of the clients that I work with. Yeah. So thanks for having me do that.
We're going to be right back, folks, to talk some more with Adena.
We heard earlier this morning about how secrets can be so powerful that if a kid was incested between 6 and 9 years of age and the secret was kept, that at 35 it would be like they were incested between 6 and 35. Okay, so a secret is so powerful that if a parent has a secret and does not deal with it appropriately, one or more of their kids are going to live it out, and they're going to live out that secret in the victim role, the passive bystander role, the rescuer role, and or the perpetrator role. Okay. And I want to remind you that bad things sometimes just happen. So it's not about blaming ourselves and all this toxic guilt. There's a piece about awareness, and then there's a piece about things happen. Okay. So if a parent has a secret, doesn't deal with it appropriately, one or more of their kids will live it out. How many of you are working with someone who is the first person in their family history to have been abused or incested? Anybody? See one hand go up. How many people aren't sure? That there might be, but they're not sure. That's more hands, okay? How many people have worked with clients, either kids, adolescents, or adults, where it's happened from generation to generation in their family? The bulk of you, that's right, because this does get passed on from generation to generation. It's called transgenerational reenactment. What I was taught by the family systems model is it takes 3 to 5 generations to stop a cycle. Do I tell my clients that? Absolutely not. How come? They'd never come back. 3 to 5 generations, why should I even bother? Okay? It can begin to stop now.
Welcome back to Walking on the Wean Side. And Adena, I have to tell you, first I'm going to tell you a joke.
Okay.
Okay, one of my favorite. It's the story about the little boy who comes home from school one day and he says to his mother, "Mommy, where did I come from?" And the mother proceeds, "Oh gosh, it's time. and she proceeds to tell him about sexuality, eggs and sperm, and how the two are brought together and pregnant. And she goes on for, well, maybe good 45 minutes. And she says, now, Johnny, do you understand? And he says, I guess so. But gee, I was just wondering, Tommy says he came from Chicago. Where do I come from? So
Exactly.
you don't want to over-explain,
Right.
but you do want to give kids the information. Now, it happens that one that I had when I work with kids, a book I loved a great deal that is available still. It's called Where Did I Come From? And it's by a man named Peter Lees. And if that name is familiar, it's because he also wrote the wonderful book A Year in Provence and many other things. But he wrote 2 children's books. One, Where Did I Come From? And another about adolescence called What's Happening to Me, if I recall the title properly. And they're wonderful resources because kids can read them, and like kids do, they will read them and then read them again and then read them again as they need more information.
Fantastic.
Because one of the things is we don't want to tell kids is you aren't supposed to know.
Exactly.
Which brings up another part of my story that I freely tell people. When I was a little boy, I remember quite seriously coming up to my father and saying to him, Dad, where do babies come from? And his response was, I'm too busy now, I'm working. I'll tell you later. Well, I quickly realized later was never going to come, which had a very important impact on my life, which was that I learned to read. The reason I learned to read was my uncle was a physician, and all his medical books, because he was away in the war, all his medical books were upstairs in our attic. And I figured they had the answers. So I learned to read. Well, the joke was on me, because by the time I learned to read, that was when I realized all those medical books were in German. That lot of good it helped me. But I did eventually learn where babies come from, not from my father. To tell you how pathological it was, I got married. I was in my late 20s when I married. And at that point, my father took it upon himself. The day before I got married, he said, Kenneth, do you want me to tell you about sex? Of course, by then I had, let's say, learned both intellectually and experientially. But it isn't just covert. And you have another book. Could you hold up that cover?
Sure.
Okay, 12 Healing Steps for Adult Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse. Now, notice that one doesn't say covert.
Right.
Because now we're going to go that next step through that line to where it really is physical sexual abuse. And again, folks, I want to remind you, it's a continuum. It's not like, okay, this is the dividing line. So what's that book? Who's that book for, and how can it help people? Let's start with that.
So that book really is for covert and overt survivors of sexual abuse. And I based it on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Mm-hmm. And I did this book because of the adult addicts that I had been working with for so many years and seeing the covert incest that was happening in their families as we looked at their families of origin, as well as their current families, because what did they learn? So what are they doing, right? Mm-hmm. Without really understanding what they were doing. And how do they heal from this? Mm-hmm. And so they were already used to the 12 steps of AA or other 12-step programs they were in, and they found that it was really helpful for them. And so this was a language they already had. Mm-hmm. And so it really translated well. And some of the therapy people were getting, they said, was just too intense for them too quickly, because it's a very potent topic. And if people aren't warmed up enough, they can really be re-traumatized, be very overwhelmed. And so to take this slowly and to use this book, what I recommend is not by yourself, but with a mentor, a trusted friend who's walked before you, a therapist, a sponsor in a program. There are programs, Incest Survivors Anonymous and Survivors of Incest Anonymous, that particularly look at this issue through the 12 steps. It used to be that program was much stronger back in the late 80s and early 90s because of the explosion of starting to talk about sexual abuse. I would say in Tucson right now, we don't have groups going. It kind of fell to the wayside, but which I think is sad. However, so this is a gentle way to be able to walk through how, you know what, it wasn't my fault. I was absolutely powerless because one of the pieces, Ken, you know this, right? It's my fault. I did something to make it happen. And the truth is, no, I was a child and I was a victim. There's nothing I could have done that made this happen. And there's also confusion often, with physical sexual abuse victims. Well, my body betrayed me because maybe it felt good. How could I have not wanted it if it felt good? It was the only way I got any attention or affection from so-and-so.
So it can be one other part of must be my fault. Okay. There is a second group, and this is the group that I found working with really horrifying to me.
Okay.
Was the multi-generational incest, where the kid is saying, that must be my fault because I know mommy did this, and grandma did it, and my cousin did it, and I'm not enjoying it. There must be something wrong with me. And that it really, I think one of the things I wanted to make sure we mentioned today is not only covert, but overt sexual abuse and incestuous behavior are things that are normalized. And I worry about that process that we normalize things that are not should not be normalized. I noticed the other day, just to go back to that broad cultural kind of thing, there was another horrific school shooting in Texas, and no outcry. Nobody's getting up. People are not calling for gun control. People are not saying anything except maybe we should have fewer doors. That comment blew my mind. But, are we normalizing the idea that we kill people, that we have these horrific shootings? Do we normalize that it's all right? Hey, so what if I want to have sex with my grandkid or my little sister or whatever?
It's interesting that you bring that up. I'm with you about that. And there are also cultures where incest is a part of that culture. Mm-hmm. So if it's a part of the culture and it's accepted, do kids have, negative experiences from it? And does post-traumatic stress happen, et cetera, right? So Patrick Carnes did research cross-culturally and said, yes, even in cultures where it's accepted, you see post-traumatic stress symptoms. People might not have the full-blown disorder, but you do see those symptoms. So there's something in the natural order that incest really, really messes with biology and development. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really, really important to say. And I think it's important to say also that the covert sexual abuse is the grooming for the next step and breach of that physical boundary for the genital contact.
Often, yes. Just as when we talk about, say, priests abusing altar boys,
they groomed them, right?
There's a grooming process. There's a prepping.
Absolutely. Developing the trust, right? And a little bit at a time. Well, this is, does this feel okay? I've worked with many male survivors of priests, and we also know that rabbis, across religions. I've done my newsletter that I have on my website monthly. I did a whole couple of several newsletters on the different religions and how the priests, the people in power, violate their parishioners sexually. And again, it's power, right? Because abuse is about power, and it's about a closed system where we don't air our dirty laundry. We don't get information from the outside. We don't give information to the outside, and that's where the abuse of power can happen. And again, I think we're seeing it in a lot of ways in our culture and our society now. It's scary. It's very scary.
Oh, you mentioned your newsletter. Maybe we should tell people what your website is so they can go there and get that newsletter.
Thank you. So, adenabanklees.com. Very simple. And I think we can put a link maybe, or we're going to have this on YouTube, right?
Yeah,
so,
it will be the podcast of the show will be on YouTube. And when it's there, we could perhaps try and add a link there. But again, you're going to www.adenabanklees.com. Now, just to spell that, Adena is Adena, Bank, B-A-N-K, and Lees, L-E-E-S. And of course, it's all run together because it's a website.
So it's Bank singular, Lees plural. Okay, Banks Lee a lot. Bank singular and Lees plural. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
And folks, look for her on Amazon, and particularly Covert Emotional Incest, The Hidden Sexual Abuse, A Story of Hope and Healing, and also that 12-step program, the practical guide, because both books might be of very great use to you. And if, by the way, you happen to be in therapy, well, if you're a therapist, you may want to know about these.
I would recommend therapists look at this book. Yes.
But if you happen to be in therapy, maybe you could suggest it to your therapist just something, hey, I heard about this on Walking on the Weene Side. And Adena, thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Ken. Take good care.
Meditation on a new coffee pot. It has, I know, begun to rain. Big drops that splat on window panes and run the glass course as they want, in merry race until they splash from the sill into the ground. While on the kitchen stove I hear the plop and drip of my new pot, a coffee pot with smells so rich to fill my nose and warm my heart with memories of golden time when hours crept and minutes stopped despite the ticking of the clock. I pour the liquid Eucharist, remembering the touch of love, remembering the sweetest kiss. Nut brown she walked as if on air, her head held high with frizzed black hair, defying discipline as she moved through the door, across the room. With arched back and swaggered step, she challenged me to not react. I failed her defiant test, reached out with moaning crave and sought her lips, bite her pink, smooth tongue, in one brief eternity embraced. It has, I know, begun to rain. Swollen, plunging tears, unrestrained, trace the lines worn in my face and slowly join, drop by drop, with the coffee from my pot.
Okay. You stopped instead, I caught your smile. I'm just no good, no good. It's too late to dream of
my coffee queen, where have you been?
all of the things we said. Where does the time all go?
I'm going to do you guys a little John party, so if you like it, please give it a like, share, subscribe.